My name is Shirley. I am the event manager at the Global Forum International House. We're a student-led organization, and we are dedicated to promoting global awareness, understanding, and citizenship through panel discussions, guest lectures, and various cultural events. So this week, we're proud to welcome the San Diego World Affairs Council, our co-sponsor for this event, and Mr. Aubrey Fox from the Institute of Economics and Peace. But first, let me make some announcements. Next week, on Monday, January 26th, the Global Forum International House will be hosting a discussion titled The Voices of Islam, a Student Conversation. It will be monitored by Professor Babak Rahimi from the Literature Department at UCSD, as well as Dr. Wael Al-Delaney from UCSD Global Health. And this will be mostly a discussion forum for Islamic students on campus to discuss their experience at UCSD and to give the San Diego and UCSD community an opportunity to learn about the perception of Muslims in our community. And on Wednesday, January 28th at 5 p.m., we'll be co-sponsoring an event with the Center on Emerging and Pacific Economies titled Democracy and Cultural Expression, Confronting Modernization in the Philippines. So it's important to know that this event will not be in the iHouse. It will be in the Roth Auditorium at the Sanford Consortium. So for those interested, you head north from Torrey Pines from here and turn left on UCSD North Point Way. And for students, you can take the Campus Loop clockwise shuttle and get off at Torrey Pines Drive. And unlike our usual events, this is free, but there's limited seating. So those who are interested, please go to our website and sign up for a spot. And finally, I'm proud to announce that the Global Forum at International House is beginning a new blog. And on this blog, we'll be posting live-casted videos of our guest speakers, as well as guest blogs from our speakers who will post relevant information about their topics. So please feel free to follow us on Twitter, as well as join our group on Facebook. So, last but not least, I would like to welcome to the stage Mr. David Edick, Jr., President of the San Diego World Affairs Council.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are blessed to have a couple of really amazing opportunities tonight. We have Aubrey Fox will be speaking in a few moments. I want to take this opportunity, though, to recognize two of our most stalwart supporters. The San Diego World Affairs Council educates and engages San Diegans in international relations, global issues, and cultural understanding. We had our annual meeting in November. Very nice turnout, excellent event, and unfortunately our two great benefactors, April and Lowell Blankford, were unable to attend, but they're here with us this evening. I want to read a brief bio of one of San Diego's really extraordinary citizens. Lowell Blankford was born in New York City in 1926. He began his newspaper reporting career during World War II. He graduated from Rutgers University in 1946, and between 1946 and 1954, he worked as a reporter, a feature writer and editor on the Long Island Star-Journal, as a writer and editor of the Wall Street Journal, and as a columnist on the London Daily Mail Continental Edition in Paris. He also served as an editor on the Stars and Stripes magazine newspaper in Germany. Between 1954 and 1959, he was publisher of the Pacific Tribune in the San Francisco Bay Area. He was a founder and charter director of the Pacifica Chamber of Commerce and active in incorporating 7 separate communities into the city of Pacifica. Lowell Blankford moved to Chula Vista in 1961. I could say that that was the year that I was born. Well, You're still here, and so am I. In that year, Lowell moved into the ownership side of the newspaper business. Quite extraordinary to have both roles. He was not afraid to speak out on any issue or shy away from any fight. And being a liberal New Yorker here in the middle of conservative San Diego, that had to have been quite an experience. Lowell was among the first publishers to take a stand against the Vietnam War, based not only on political and moral reasons, but also on his personal observations gathered from a visit to Vietnam in 1960. When the war was over, he defended the rights of Vietnamese refugees who came to California. Lowell has been to more than 80 countries. I'm sure it's more than that now. Adding to his knowledge of world events, he was president of the San Diego chapter of the World Federalist Association, and during much of the 1990s, he was president of the San Diego World Affairs Council. I want to take this opportunity to present a certificate of appreciation to Lowell and April Blankford for their extraordinary service. If you get an opportunity to chat with them after Aubrey's presentation, please take the opportunity. And in the meantime, thank you, Lowell. Tremendous experience that both the Blankfords have.
It's 115 countries I visited.
115 countries.
It's about Wales and Scotland.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Now for our speaker tonight, here from New York City, Aubrey Fox is the Executive Director of the Institute for Economics and Peace USA, a nonprofit think tank dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, achievable, and tangible measure of human well-being and progress. The Institute for Economics and Peace is a global think tank founded in 2009 by the Australian entrepreneur and philanthropist Steve Killalea? Killalea, okay, all right. The mission, sorry about that. The mission of the organization is to measure peace through well-defined conceptual frameworks and quantifiable metrics. The Institute is best known for the Global Peace Index, which ranks 162 countries on their peacefulness. And we'll also hear tonight about the Mexico Peace Index. It's a very important idea for San Diego. Aubrey graduated with a master's degree in public policy from the University of California at Berkeley. Well done. Served as a VISTA volunteer in San Antonio, Texas. Was a Warren Weaver Fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation and a member of Coro's Leadership New York program. His writing has appeared in Newsday, the Gotham Gazette, Judicature, the Justice System Journal, and Court Review, along with other publications. Prior to joining the Institute for Economics and Peace, Aubrey was a member of the senior leadership team at the Center for Court Innovation, an organization which helps the justice system and aid victims reduce crime and strengthen neighborhoods, improve public trust and justice. He's the co-author of Trial and Error in Criminal Justice Reform, Learning from Failure. Well, tonight, he's going to talk to us about the Global Peace Index and the Mexico Peace Index. Please welcome Aubrey Fox.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone. to try to speak relatively informally because we don't have a huge audience here and we have such interesting people. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your support of the World Affairs Council. Before I begin, I want to just point out in the audience we have someone who's very important to the Institute for Economics and Peace, Alberto Capel, who has supported our work in Mexico. And I thank Alberto for all of his support. And so tonight I'm going to talk, as David mentioned, about this issue of how do you measure peace? How do you understand peace from a numerical standpoint? And if you can measure it, what does it tell you about the state of peace in the world? And what does it tell you about whether the world can be made a more peaceful place? As a New Yorker, I ride cabs all the time. I don't like to drive if I can avoid it. And I had a cabbie take me to the speech tonight. And he told me that he used to live in New York in the 1980s, when it was a much less safe place to live. And the organization that I worked for before I came to the Institute for Economics and Peace worked on criminal justice reform in New York for the last 15 years. And New York is a much more peaceful place. This is something that the cab driver mentioned to me. It's actually become peaceful by many orders of magnitude. And one of the reasons that New York became a more peaceful place is because the officials within the police department and within the mayor's office started to take a much closer look at the data. They tried to understand what the patterns of crime in New York were, where crime occurred, at what times it occurred, and who was committing most of the crime in the city. They started to understand how police officers did their work, what kind of activity they were responsible for. And it was the data revolution in New York that really helped drive the declines in crime in the city. And it's something that I think about a lot in my new role in the Institute for Economics and Peace. I think we live in a world now where there's a lot more demand for data, where people want to understand the impact of what you're doing, where funders, foundations, government officials want more accountability from the work that nonprofit agencies and other government agencies do. And that's a healthy thing in general, but it does produce some demands on all of us. And the peace world is an interesting example. I think in the past, peace has been thought of as a kind of aspirational goal, something that a goal that everyone agrees they want to reach, but not something that has been understood through the hard-nosed lens of science. And so part of our goal as an institution is to start by establishing the facts. What do we know about the world and how peaceful it is? And so this is who we are. As David mentioned, we're an international research organization. We're dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers and measures of peace and to identifying the economic benefits that increased peacefulness can deliver. And we have offices in Sydney, New York, and Mexico City. So how do we define peace? In our understanding, peace is more than just the absence of war, and I think this is another important distinction that we bring to this work. We don't see peace as just the opposite of war. We see peace as the opposite of the everyday kinds of conflict that citizens experience. And so that could include interpersonal violence, homicide, daily crime, fear of going out to the street at night. So our definition of peace encompasses much more than just the absence of war, but we define it as the absence of violence. And that allows us to measure both what we call internal and external peacefulness. So internal peacefulness would refer to the everyday experience of violence that a citizen might have, whereas external measures of peacefulness might refer to war between countries. And we also are trying to pioneer the study of positive peace. So this means not just understanding and quantifying negative things that occur, everyday crime and violence, but the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures of more peaceful nations. And this goes back to the historic definition of peace that was pioneered in the 1960s by a sociologist named Johann Gatland, who said that you have to understand peace as both a negative and a positive condition. A negative peace is the absence of fear, the absence of violence or the fear of violence. Whereas positive peace are the formal and informal institutions that move a society away from violence and towards peace. Now the interesting thing about that, that typology and the differences between those two is that negative peace is what we tend to measure. We measure crime statistics. We measure the number of homicides. We measure the number of crimes that occur. We report them through government statistics. We read about them in the newspaper. We use negative peace as the basis of our global peace index. Positive peace is something that we tend to understand less about. So we have spent a less time talking about what underlies societies that are peaceful than we do talking about what are the factors that underlie societies that are experiencing violence. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that our signature piece of research is something called the Global Peace Index. And what the Global Peace Index does is it ranks 162 countries on their peacefulness using 22 indicators. So essentially what we do is we take indicators that other organizations, information that other organizations gather, and we compile it into a composite index that allows us to represent in one score the peacefulness of 162 nations. And we do this in partnership with a panel of international experts and with data collected and collated by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And so I wanted to actually talk a little bit about how we go through the process of collecting our indicators. I mentioned earlier that we use 22 indicators. And 5 of them are measures of ongoing domestic and international conflict. For example, the number of conflicts fought and the number of deaths from organized conflict. That would speak to our more traditional understanding of what we mean by war. We also have measures of societal safety and security. So number of displaced people, number of terrorist acts, number of homicides, number of jailed population. And we have 7 measures of militarization. Military expenditure, number of armed service personnel, ease of access to small weapons. Now, I'll take you into an example of an indicator because I think it helps give us a picture of how we do our work. Okay, so I chose this indicator for a particular reason because it is one of the more worrying problems that the world faces today. The number of refugees and displaced people as percent of population. Today, we have the highest number of refugees in the world since the end of World War II. It's an enormous problem that the world is grappling with. And so what we do is we look at the 162 countries in the Global Peace Index, and we use information gathered by the UN High Commissioner of Refugees and the International Displacement Center. And we give a score to each country that ranges between 1 and 5. The lower your score, the better you are. And so for each country, we look at the percentage of the population who are refugees and displaced people. And if, just to go through an example, if you have between 0 and 1.5% of your population as a refugee or displaced people, then you're given a score of 1. If you have more than 12.15% of your population as a refugee or displaced person, then you get a score of 5. Just to cite one example of how this problem is really beginning to, in some ways, spiral out of control. Right now in Syria, half of the country is displaced. There are 6 million Syrians who are displaced within Syria, meaning they've fled their homes, but they're still within the country. And 3 million Syrians who have fled to other countries, either in the region or internationally. The 22 indicators, we go through a similar process. We take an issue that speaks to peace in the world, and we try to understand it as much as possible through quantitative methods. I won't go through the other 21, but I wanted to just pick out one as an illustration. So what have we found? My clicker is working on a little bit of delay here. Okay, so we have been releasing the Global Peace Index for 8 years now. And one of the headlines we found is that the level of peace has slightly gone down for 7 years in a row, which is obviously a cause for concern. And that deterioration is primarily coming from a few particular factors. Terrorist activity, obviously a huge problem, which I'll get into a little bit more detail in a minute. Number of internal and external conflicts fought, deaths from internal conflicts, and the number of refugees and displaced people. There have been some improvements. So we have seen from 2012 to 2013 some small declines in political terror. So that means the state repression of its citizens. Number of armed service personnel and number of homicides. Although it should be noted that over the 8-year period that we've been conducting the Global Peace Index, homicides have gone up quite sharply. There's something on the order of 450,000 homicides per year worldwide. And that represents a huge increase since we began the Global Peace Index. And it reinforces one of our points, which is that the nature of everyday violence has changed. That while war between nations is obviously still a problem, there's a growing toll that's posed by everyday interpersonal violence. And that's certainly true in a country like Mexico, which is going through a huge internal conflicts driven by violent crime. Okay, so here are the 10 least peaceful countries in the world, as measured by the latest edition of the Global Peace Index. I don't think any of these will come as a surprise. So you have Syria topping the list. I mentioned some of Syria's issues earlier. You have Afghanistan, South Sudan, Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, so forth and so on. Here are the 10 most peaceful countries. So if you're planning your next trip, take a look at these countries: Iceland, Denmark, Austria, New Zealand, Switzerland, Finland, Canada, Japan, Belgium, and Norway. Okay, so I mentioned a little earlier that terrorism is one of the issues that we've seen some of the most rapid increases in. And we decided that we needed to take a closer look at the issue of terrorism. And obviously it's an issue that is in the news every day in the last few months. And so what we did was we partnered with an academic center at the University of Maryland called START. And what START has, which makes it unique, is the world's leading database on terrorist incidents. So they actually collect and maintain a database of 125,000 terrorist incidents worldwide. And what's interesting about that is that terrorism is not an official statistic that is captured by most governments. And in fact, there's a lot of debates about the very definition of terrorism. What is a terrorist act and what isn't a terrorist act? And so terrorism is an example of an issue that tends to fall out of people's understandings because no one is gathering even basic data about it. And that's what START, our academic partner at the University of Maryland, that's the gap that they sought to fill by seeking to understand the basic data about terrorism. We released this report in November 2014, and I can tell you that it's probably one of the most impactful reports that we've ever released in terms of the media coverage and reaction to the report. And I think because there's real hunger for people to understand terrorism as an issue and understand the data about terrorism. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, but dismayingly, we found that 2013, which was the year that we covered in the Global Terrorism Index, was the deadliest year in the 14 years covered in the research done by the University of Maryland. And unfortunately, I think 2014 will prove to be even more deadly. So, between 2012 and 2013, we saw enormous increases in the number of deaths from terrorist incidents. And in fact, if you go back to 2000, it's an increase of 5 times. Now, one of the really interesting things to come out of the research, and it in some ways is counter to the public understanding of terrorism, given that there have been some incidents in Western nations lately, such as Paris and France, is that terrorism is really a study of concentration. That in 2013, 5 countries accounted for 82% of terrorist deaths. Countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. 4 organizations account for 2/3 of recorded deaths. At the same time, there are more and more countries that are experiencing over 50 deaths. So there is both an increase in particular countries and a broadening of countries that are experiencing this. And this chart I find particularly fascinating because it tells a story about terrorism that in some ways is very uncomfortable, but it's a story that I think we need to reckon with. So if you look at this chart, this shows the increases of terrorist deaths from 2000 to 2013. And what you find is that after 2001 and the spike of deaths caused largely by 9/11, you have a decline after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, that right up until the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But after that point, you have a pretty incredible increase from about 3,000 deaths a year to around 11,000, leading up to the U.S. troop surge in 2007. Now that troop surge was able to dampen down terrorist deaths until the beginning of the Syrian civil war, at which point it is zoomed ahead. And I think this makes a couple of points that are important. One is that terrorism is intertwined with global geopolitics. And terrorism also tends to take roots in countries that are overwhelmed by internal strife. And I think that is, in fact, a very important story for the world to grapple with. That there are often unintended consequences to the actions, particularly of Western nations. And so 5 countries account for more than 80% of global terrorist activities. We took a look at the factors that are most closely associated with terrorism. So this is a statistical analysis of what factors appear to drive increases in terrorism. And we found that we could identify 4. Countries with more state-sponsored violence, countries with less cohesion between groups in those countries, countries where the state was not seen as being legitimate by citizens, and high levels of other forms of violence. So what that says is that terrorism tends to take hold in nations that are fragile or failed. That, in fact, terrorism is really driven by state failure more than anything else. Factors that we cannot find a statistical association with terrorism, some of them are quite interesting. So, essentially, we found that the kind of classic measures of poverty did not, in fact, predict more terrorism. And this is a finding that's been repeated in other research on terrorism, that there is no easy link between poverty and terrorism. The more important factor appears to be, again, the kind of legitimacy and strength of the state. So I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. This is another interesting slide that got a lot of attention from our report. The think tank RAND did an analysis of how terrorist groups end. They looked at 256 terrorist groups that had concluded their operations, and they asked, how did that group end? What was the sort of strategy that led to the termination of terrorist activity? And they found that in only 7% of cases could you say that the application of military force alone led to the end of that terrorist group. That much more likely, in 6 cases out of 7, it was either the terrorist group being brought into the political process, as in Northern Ireland, or improvements in local policing, improvements in intelligence gathering and in enforcing law with these terrorist groups. Again, a very interesting counter-narrative to the kind of responses that we find quite often to terrorism. And this is just the last slide that I'll highlight about terrorism in 2002 compared to 2013. I find this to be very fascinating. So on the left, you find the top 10 countries in 2002 that experienced terrorist deaths. And on the right, you find the top 10 countries in 2013 that experienced terrorist deaths. And what I find absolutely fascinating about this chart is that none of the countries that experienced the most terrorism in 2002 are the countries that experienced the most terrorism in 2013. So terrorism is a rapidly changing phenomenon. And I think the other point that this makes is that we have to be very careful about the unintended consequences of our actions today. That what we set in motion today, such as the invasion of Iraq, could lead to very different consequences than we see today. And then the last point, quickly, is that terrorism fatalities in the Western nations represent only a small number of the total. So despite high-profile incidents in Paris and other Western nations, for the most part, terrorism is a problem confined to countries outside of the Western nations. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Mexico Peace Index, which is one of my very favorite pieces of work that we do. So both the Global Peace Index and the Global Terrorism Index, as the title suggests, have a very broad perspective. They're looking at 162 nations of the world, and they're detecting kind of overall patterns in these nations. What we thought we would do is try to take a closer look at one country and try to understand patterns of conflict and violence in that country. And we decided to pick Mexico for several reasons. One is that Mexico is a country that is going through, quite frankly, a crisis of crime and violence at the moment. Rates of violence in Mexico have soared in recent years, fueled by the drug trade and gang violence. And Mexico is a country that, relative to its economic performance and its economic potential and its peace potential, has more violence than it should have in terms of the global averages. So we really wanted to understand what is going on in Mexico that is driving these issues. And so in November 2013, we released the Mexico Peace Index, which ranks the 32 states of Mexico, which you can see in small print along the right side of the chart, on their peacefulness, using a similar methodology as the Global Peace Index. Although we focus on a smaller set of indicators, 7 indicators in all, that are largely about the everyday toll of violence in that country. Now again, this report was released in November 2013. We have another edition coming out in next March. So we'll have data through the end of 2014 when the next report is released. But when we released the Mexico Peace Index in 2013, we had data up until the end of 2012. And you can see that Mexico had become significantly less peaceful from 2003. And that in fact, that levels of peacefulness had gone down quite dramatically after 2007. And so you had kind of the two stories going on in Mexico simultaneously. You had, through NAFTA and improved trade relations with the United States, some real improvements in Mexico's economic performance. But at the same time, you had a growing toll of violence in the country. And so one of the points that we tried to make in the Mexico Peace Index is that from the outside looking in, Mexico looks like one homogeneous country experiencing the same problems everywhere. But in fact, you have a great deal of variation regionally in Mexico. So this chart shows that the homicide rate, which is one of our 7 indicators that we use in the Mexico Peace Index, those trends differ quite enormously depending on what region of the country you're looking at. And so the north of Mexico experiencing the most serious increases in homicide, although with the exception of southern Mexico and central Mexico, other regions experienced increases as well. So we released, as I said, we released this report in November 2013, and I was very impressed by how the report was received in Mexico. And I just picked out a couple of examples of articles that were printed about the Mexico Peace Index to give you a sense of how the report itself was received and interpreted in Mexico. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting is depending on where we were and which part of Mexico the reporting came from, people focused on different things. So this is a report from Sinaloa, which is one of the states of Mexico that is experiencing particularly difficult problems of violence. And what they found interesting about our report wasn't our raw statistics about violence, but the cost of violence to Sinaloa, the cost of violence to that particular state. And so, as part of our report, we developed a methodology that described, if you added up all of the various economic impacts of violence, both direct spending on the police, on the judiciary, the toll of violent victimization, the toll of healthcare and other associated costs, how much does violence cost Mexico? And in this one state, we found that the toll was particularly great. In another state, in Monterrey, another city in Monterrey, they picked up on another part of our report, which focuses on impunity rates. So the percent of homicides that went unpunished. Now, in this particular state of Mexico, 93% of homicides do not come to justice. So that means that only 7% of people who commit a homicide are convicted in a court of law. I mean, that's a startling finding. It suggests, again, a part of Mexico where the state isn't functioning very well. And that's the part of the report that in Monterrey they were particularly interested in. And I think that speaks to one of the goals of our work, which is to be this neutral, objective, and unimpeachable source of information about peace and violence in the world. Now, we also looked at what we call the global cost of violence, and we've developed a methodology that, much like I described in our work in Mexico, attempts to show how much is the world spending, either dealing with the consequences of violence or attempting to contain violence directly. And we found that it's an enormous amount of money, about 11.3% of gross world product, close to $10 trillion in US dollars. And part of the reason that we do this is because, at the moment there are a lot of debates about how various social services are performing. So we spend a lot of time, for example, in the United States thinking about the percent of our economy devoted to healthcare and whether we're getting value for our dollar. I think estimates range from something like 16 to 18% of the U.S. economy is spent on healthcare. And there's an enormous conversation about the accountability of the healthcare system and how to drive down costs. If you think about violence containment as its own industry, then that leads to some very interesting similar analysis. And so part of our goal as an institution is to try to get people to think about violence containment as an industry, much like healthcare is an industry, and start to ask questions about what are we spending money on and what are we getting as a result. And so we took a look at violence expenditure as a percentage of gross domestic product in our global peace index. Now, if you look at just raw dollars, the United States spends significantly more than any other nation, something like $1.7 trillion to maintain its military, its police force, to imprison people, again, the victimization costs of victims of violent crime, etc. But as a percentage of gross domestic product, it is not in the top 10. It's actually pretty far down in the 40s. Other countries, which have a much smaller economy, spend, as a percentage of their gross domestic product, an enormous amount of money. And so one of the points that we make in our research is that for countries like Honduras, Zimbabwe, Somalia, Cote d'Ivoire, these are countries that are under enormous pressure already, and they, for understandable reasons, often are spending a lot of their wealth on attempting to contain violence, and that may not be the most efficient use of their resources, which may in fact drive them further into poverty. Now let's go to Mexico. Now, in November 2013, we reported that a more expansive definition of the economic impact of violence in 2012. So we included both direct costs and indirect costs. So that 15.8% of GDP is comparable to what we report here. But we also added a multiplier to suggest basically the opportunity cost of spending money on violence containment. So essentially a dollar spent on the police force, on the judiciary, on your military is a dollar you're not spending on some other form of productive economic activity. And so when you add that multiplier, the economic impact of violence in Mexico in 2012 was close to 28% of Mexican GDP. So again, an enormous, enormous number. Now we also looked at peace and economic performance. So this is in Mexico, and what we found basically is that, perhaps not surprisingly, the most peaceful states in 2003, their economy grew at a rate that was much faster than the least peaceful states in 2013. Although I will point out that 2007, that period between 2007 and 2009 was clearly a disaster for all of Mexico. We also looked at the peace potential, economic peace potential in Mexico. So this again refers to some of the opportunity costs of the toll of economic, of violence containment costs. So we found, for example, that a 20% reduction in violence and crime would be equivalent to the amount required to organize the 2014 Soccer World Cup in Brazil. And then if you had been able to keep violence containment expenditure at the level of 2003, Mexico would have enough money to pay for the modernization of the entire public transport infrastructure. Okay, so let's talk about positive peace for a moment. I said earlier that we are attempting not just to capture the bad stuff, the toll of violence in the world, the amount of money being spent on violence containment, but also some of the good stuff. What are the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that sustain a peaceful society? And through some separate analysis that we've done, we've identified the so-called 8 pillars of peace. These are the 8 pillars of more peaceful society. And they're things that probably won't come as a huge surprise to people. Well-functioning government, low levels of corruption, higher levels of human capital, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, acceptance of the rights of others, equitable distribution of resources, and sound business environment. If you have those 8, then you will have a more peaceful society. And when you map the presence of those pillars of peace, that's the sort of left axis of this chart, the positive. These are the rankings of countries by their positive peace ranks on the left, and the Global Peace Index ranking, their negative peace ranking on the right. You find that relationship is actually very very strong. In statistical terms, this is a very strong correlation. So as positive peace rises, or as countries have higher levels of positive peace, they also have lower rankings on the Global Peace Index. There are a few notable outliers. The United States of America has very high levels of positive peace, so they have high institutions and positive peace potential. But in terms of their actual peace, we rank pretty low. So the United States ranks 101st out of 162 countries on our Global Peace Index. And that's largely due to factors such as relatively high rates of violent crime that, although have declined in recent decades, and high rates of incarceration. So the United States has 25% of the world's incarcerated population, despite having only 5% of the world's population. Okay. So, again, interesting point to make about Mexico. If you compare Mexico's positive peace to its negative peace, so again, its peace potential, the attitudes, institutions, and structures of Mexico, and its actual peace levels, in many ways, Mexico has more peace potential than is being realized in its actual peace. So, relative to other countries in the world, it has higher levels of human capital. Its resources are distributed more equitably, again, relative to the rest of the world, and it has a sound business environment. A couple of areas where Mexico absolutely needs to improve. Free flow of information stands out. The free press is challenged in Mexico. You've had many journalists murdered in Mexico. That is a big issue in Mexico at the moment. Also, concerns about the basic functioning of government, and an issue that also really stands out about Mexico are citizen perceptions of the level of corruption in society. So Mexico has relatively higher perceptions of corruption as a country than other nations. I think I won't get into this. Okay, so I'm just going to end here with a few points about kind of why this work matters. And kind of the question of sort of, so what? Like, we've gathered all this data, we started to understand a little bit about the peacefulness of nations in the world, the peacefulness of a nation like Mexico. What are the implications of that research? So a little bit about the Institute for Economics and Peace. We've gotten a lot of interest in this work globally. We've done a lot of work with international media. This is a New York Times article from our most recent report, the Global Terrorism Index. You can see some other work from The Atlantic and CNN's Global Square. And I put this up partly to, I guess, to show my pride in how the institution has functioned. But I think the larger point to make is that these are very heated topics. Terrorism in particular is a very heated topic. And we fill a void by providing very neutral and objective information to the world. And I think we are responding to a real need. You can find all of our information on our website, visionofhumanity.org. We have interactive maps where you can look at each country and look at more detailed information about that country. We've done a lot of work with academic institutions in the United States and around the world. And we've done a lot of work with the United Nations. So one of the very interesting debates right now that is occurring within the United Nations is they are setting what they call the Sustainable Development Goals, which will guide the work of member states within the United Nations between 2015 and 2030. So the idea is, what are the priorities of the world for addressing big social problems? Can we identify a subset of goals and measures so that we can understand our progress against those goals. And in the period between 2000 and 2015, those were known as the Millennium Development Goals. And those goals drove a lot of global practice on issues like attempts to reduce maternal mortality, improve education levels among women and girls worldwide. And the Millennium Development Goals were a landmark document for the world in priority setting. And we've come to the end of the period of the Millennium Development Goals, and they're now being replaced by something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the active debates and unsettled questions about the Sustainable Development Goals is whether there should be an explicit goal around violence and conflict. In the last round of goal setting, they did not have a goal that was explicitly related to violence or conflict. And it turns out that depending on what goal you were looking at, whether it was reductions in maternal mortality or improvements in education levels, countries that experienced great deals of violence were unable to reach those goals. So our argument as an institution is that peace is not just one issue among many, but it may be the issue that is driving the world's ability to meet other goals that it's attempting to meet. And so we have been arguing that alongside more traditional human development goals, there should be an explicit goal around reductions in peace and conflict set by the United Nations. And at the moment, after a long debate, and this debate is not over, there has been a goal known as Goal 16 that has been identified to track violence and conflict worldwide. And we have been part of that process. Okay. And so, just in conclusion, if you're interested in learning more about our research, you can come to our website again, visionofhumanity.org. And then just wanted to wrap up really with the questions that I wanted to ask when I started this presentation. And I'll leave this question up, both to get reactions from the audience, and I invite your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rather than moderate, pick who's going to answer or ask questions. I'm just going to let you go with that. I'd like to be the last question. I'd also like to be the first. I was very intrigued by, on the Mexican Peace Index, the rather dramatic difference between the state of violence or peace in the states of Guerrero versus Oaxaca. Why is that?
Yeah, basically we've looked at states, and there are some states that have been able to essentially implement improvements in policing and other criminal justice reforms. One of the interesting things is that there are states that I think most Americans would not identify as being more peaceful, but have in fact been able to drive great reductions in peacefulness. And I think we're only at the beginning of the process of understanding the dynamics of those states. So we know, I can't give you a complete answer to your question because we've only just begun that our ability to understand what is in fact driving greater peacefulness in those areas.
Research opportunity.
Yeah. Rebecca?
So, first of all, congratulations for the work you have been doing. It's always inspiring and great to know there's institutions like you, doing this type of research work. There's this question that I have regarding measuring peace, and this is something I have asked Michelle and Steve a lot. And I wanted to get your opinion based on your experience on, your role as the innovation core type of project you did, and looking at the successful story of New York. And it's about how can you adapt technology to open up this type of, publications in a way of taking advantage of open data and have access to these statistics faster. If I assure you that the new Mexico Peace Index of 2015 is going to be way more different than the one of 2015. And taking also in consideration that we have a corrupt government. So the information that is published is not 100% accurate. And I think what we want to be able to accomplish is to receive, as much tangible information to make decisions. And I feel that technology will take the best role here. And I would like to see if there's any conversations around the Institute of how to, help the government on using better systems. Or probably the government is not the best partner and society will. And what kind of campaigns can you run around that?
Right. Well, and I think that's a great question. And I think one thing to point out at the beginning is that any index is an imperfect instrument. You're using the best available data in the best way that you know how. And I think what we do with the Global Peace Index and all our indices is that we're absolutely transparent about the methods we use, about the data sources that we're relying on, and how we weigh the data. And we don't do the work, a lot of this. We don't do the work on our own. So we work with an expert panel of researchers for all of the work we do. And in the case of Mexico, as you know, there's raging debates about the various government statistics that are gathered, whether one form of statistics is more reliable than the other. And I think we have to make the most reasonable choices that we can. Now, in terms of your question about technology, it's not related to Mexico, but with the Global Peace Index, because of our partnership with the University of Maryland, we were able to turn one of our indicators in the Global Peace Index, which was the indicator on terrorism, from a qualitative indicator. Essentially, we used experts from around the world who gave us a qualitative sense of the impact of terrorism on that country. We were able to convert that to a quantitative indicator because of the existence of the database that's collected by the University of Maryland. And so I think if I reinterpret your question, how can we as an institution make partnerships like the one with the University of Maryland that will improve the quality of the data that we have available? University of Maryland uses extremely innovative techniques to gather data that isn't gathered by official government agencies. If we were able to create those kinds of partnerships, then we would all benefit. I think in the case of Mexico, it is absolutely important. And I will say that even though we rely to a large extent on official government statistics, again, we're making very reasoned judgments based on our expert panel. And I think the way that the Mexico Peace Index has been received is that it has attained a kind of surprising, to my mind, amount of legitimacy. And I don't say surprising because it's less than the report itself deserves. I think it's surprising in the sense that there is such a hunger in Mexico for reliable information. And because we don't solicit or receive government funding, we are seen as an independent organization with worldwide expertise. And that I think allows us to do something in Mexico that other institutions aren't able to. But we have to continue to improve our work.
Please excuse me for asking such a simple question. But I don't know what you mean by high levels of human capital.
Yeah. Well, that's a reasonable question. So human capital just refers to the level of education of citizens.
That's what I thought. I wasn't sure.
I could ask a question, actually. I noticed that Spain has a really high level of very focused on peace in the perspective of war. But I know that Spain is a huge brewing ground for Al-Qaeda, and there's high unemployment, and there's constant protests, and crime against women is an issue. So do you and how do you incorporate those more social and less directly military related factors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just looked it up really quickly. Spain is ranked 26th in the Global Peace Index, despite having very high levels of unemployment. And some of the specific things you mentioned are actually very interesting issues for us. I mean, for example, Spain has had a number of political demonstrations and a lot of conflict between citizens and the state. That will be measured in the Global Peace Index. So that's being picked up. You mentioned violence against women. Now that's a absolutely fascinating issue that applies not just in Spain, but to all of the countries in our index. We do not currently have an indicator that looks exclusively at violence against women. The reason we don't have such an indicator is not because we don't want to have it in our index, it's because right now, and this gets to Rebecca's point about statistical capacity, there are no reliable data sets that would allow us to measure the toll of violence against women in the world. We are working on, as an institution, we're actually working on attempting to fill that gap. But if you look right now at official statistics about violence against women, you would actually find that nations in Western Europe, which are more reliable about reporting the data and supporting victims, have higher official rates of violence against women than countries that we know have a greater toll of that kind of violence. Now, violence against women is reflected in other statistics that we collect, but it is not itself a measure. And I think that's a gap for us and something that we want to work on. And one of the nice things about going back to the Global Peace Index year after year after year is that you can make conservative changes to the index. You can add indicators, you can take them out, or you can refine them to increase the power of the work.
Sorry, if no one has a follow-up, can I ask another one? What's the reaction to the implication that U.S. military involvement increases terrorism?
Well, so I could answer that. I could answer two questions. What is the reaction to the fact that we count U.S. military expenditure as an indicator, and that, in a sense, some people perceive our index as penalizing the United States in the Global Peace Index rankings for spending a lot on its military. So, actually, that concern that some have shared with us is a little overstated because we measure military spending as a percent of GDP, and despite the U.S.'s large outlays on the military, that percentage is actually relatively modest. Now, your point about the impact on terrorism. So, it's a controversial point, but I don't think you can reasonably dispute the idea that these enormous increases in terrorism worldwide are happening precisely in the countries where the U.S. military has operated the most aggressively. And I don't think there's a lot of disagreement, in fact. There's less disagreement on that point than you would think.
Would your data suggest correlation or causation, or maybe both?
Well, I think what our data suggests is that military action in these countries did not impact the drivers that would inhibit terrorist activity. What military action did was it accelerated the factors that lead to more terrorist activity. So it took states that were already unstable and made them even more unstable and created a target that became a kind of organizing rallying cry for terrorist activity. One very concrete example of this is that we didn't just spend a lot of money on our military, we spent a lot of money attempting to reconstruct these countries. And a great deal of that money got absorbed in corruption. And we know that corruption is a uniquely corroding effect on citizens' perceptions of the legitimacy of the state. And that as corruption goes up, and I didn't include this slide in the presentation, but we've shown that as corruption goes up, it reaches a tipping point, right? Where its impact on people's perceptions of the legitimacy of the country fall off a cliff. So as corruption increases modestly, people
More apathetic and
people are slightly less confident in their government, but when it reaches a certain point, which is only a kind of moderate level in terms of perceptions of corruption, people's perceptions of government drop rather dramatically. And so it isn't just military spending per se, it's the full range of spending we're doing in those countries. But the point is that we're actually not making those countries more stable. We're not making the institutions of government more stable. We're making them less stable. And that's what is driving terrorist activity.
thank you, it's very simple.
Oh, just wanted to know, I heard from a person in the government that maybe Tijuana was as dangerous as Mexico City with the drug people and so on. I mean, I just want to know.
Well, I mean, certainly, Tijuana has experienced many problems. But, you have to, Mexico City is an enormous city. And so you would ask, are there certain areas of Tijuana that are, experiencing similar problems as Mexico City? And there are areas of Tijuana that are actually doing quite well. So it's a difficult question to answer.
This was a government employee. But I want to know more. I mean, I loved Tijuana before. And it's like I haven't been back there for a while. Okay, good.
Rebecca, would you like to
I
answer?
go there every month.
Good. And
Go to Tijuana.
And I was with the World Affairs Council going there to the Consul General's house, and we got lost in the mountains, and that was back in like 1994. And it was so much fun. It's like, I hope it's good again.
Anyone else?
Well, I'm going to ask this one last question.
Oh, did you have a question? Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
As far as the numbers, for example, like your 2014 global impact, do those numbers also incorporate future projections of possible preventative projects governments are looking into in order to bring down peace, or is this research only looking at the now and the past history of the country?
That's a great question. It's something that I did not include in the presentation, but we have in fact looked forward. And what we've done is we've said, if you look at a country's potential for peace as measured through positive peace, what do we predict about future actual levels of violence in those countries? And what we're able to show is that countries that have higher levels of peace potential than their actual peace, more likely than not, their actual peace levels are going to go up, and vice versa. And so we've created what amounts to a risk tool that says, what are some of the countries in the world that we're most worried about experiencing small to medium drops in peace? And that's because those are countries where their actual peace levels are better than their peace potential would appear. And we've tested that model. We can't test it in the future for obvious reasons, but we've tested that model in the past. We've looked back and said, if you look at the 30 countries in 2008 that had higher levels of peace than their peace potential would indicate, and you look at them in 2013, 27 of those 30 countries fell in peace. And so that's a pretty powerful risk tool. And our risk tool at least in its early days, appears to at least equally perform, if not outperform, other risk tools that are used by large international institutions. Risk tool is a very important, as you might imagine, tool that, for example, the World Bank uses to determine how much it charges countries for loans. So if they think a country is really risky, they'll charge more than a country they feel is less risky. And that risk tool appears to not perform as well as ours. So that's an example of kind of, it's a great question, it's an example of a really tangible thing that we're working on.
Well, we're getting right down here to the end here. I did want to ask one final question. How is your work being received inside the Beltway? What's the effect in the United States government?
Well, one of the slides that I didn't talk about earlier, we actually were contributed to, in 2012, the defense bill was passed with kind of an explicit instruction to collect data about world peace levels. And so that was something that we kind of played a role in. And I would say that, you know, our influence within the Beltway is only beginning to grow. We did, for the Global Terrorism Index, we did a briefing on the Hill that was hosted by Congressman John Garamendi, who's actually the congressman from here in California. And he's on the House Armed Services Committee. And Congressman Garamendi is a great friend of ours, and probably already a convert to our cause. But I think the reality is that for the last 10 to 12 years, the world has kind of lurched from one crisis to another. And I don't think it's just us saying that the policy tools we're using to respond to world problems aren't working. I think it's patently obvious to everyone. I think the question is, how do you drive support, how do you tilt the balance away from kind of short-term crisis intervention thinking to long-term investments in more peaceful societies? That is the $64 million question. For example, we know with some reasonable confidence how much money we're spending on our military. That's tracked by websites. It's obviously a number that goes into the trillions. You know, we even know that, for example, certain particular kinds of investments, like investments in the F-35 jet plane, is already totaled in the trillions, and it's a plane that may never fly. We don't even understand how much money we're spending on peacekeeping. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that falls under the peacekeeping banner. Right. But we have no idea how much we're spending. And so if you don't know how much you're spending now on something that you're advocating for more spending on, you're in a tough position. So I think there's a lot of really foundational work that we have to do as an institution to drive this conversation away from kind of the short-term crisis mentality and towards investments in the long-term pillars of peace that appear to pay off in greater peacefulness, addressing the very issues that we care about, like terrorism. Thank you for the question.
Ladies and gentlemen, a hand for Aubrey Fox and the work that is